subject of detached frontage revisions and neighborhood transitions.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So I've boiled down the presentation and slides a little bit from what we've had before and try to make it more clear, the questions that are before the committee and ultimately the council. So it's somewhat familiar, but hopefully a little bit more aligned with some of the questions, the key questions that I think the committee is hoping to address. So I just at the most broad level, the city's changing, evolving, and one of the ongoing questions is maintaining neighborhood scale in places characterized by detached houses, but also allowing the city to evolve in terms of use and density. And that's what I think some of these questions are getting towards. And in particular, I know from the outset of this conversation, started last year, one of the desires was to think about facilitating the retention of older houses, some of the really fine houses along Hillsborough Street, as an example, other areas as well, by facilitating their use for office, because they were built for a particular purpose a long time ago, no longer for residential, no longer necessarily as desirable for that purpose, and this is a way to extend their lifespan as beautiful structures. At the same time, also looking at ways to create additional housing variety and housing options while maintaining that neighborhood scale. So those are the big topics that some of these pretty fine grain, deep into the code revisions are looking to address. Again, residential scale office, that could be an existing building that's been retrofitted for office or something that's newly constructed. We're trying to think about that as well. In terms of tools, historic preservation, we talked about some of those older houses. That is one, but difficult to apply, obviously, and doesn't necessarily provide the guarantee that it would serve the purpose in the end either, because it's not an absolute prohibition on demolition. So the proposal here to looking at the detached frontage, in fact, the creation of that frontage originally was a way to allow those kinds of uses in those buildings. And this is a way to think about, well, if there was to be an addition, how could we, that would make it more desirable to continue using the same building? Could this facilitate that by reducing the transition standard? So if somebody needed some more office space in one of those buildings, they could potentially do that. And then the related topic, missing middle housing, looking at duplexes, small apartments, how can we look at facilitating that, again, while maintaining the existing scale of older neighborhoods. And so this has a proposal for addressing that as well. And I would note that really a two-part approach for that, and I think there's a question here for the committee today and council as well. What's the right approach? So one is a broader approach. We've talked about a study, citywide scale study of these housing types and how better to accommodate them, look at how zoning is creating barriers and how those could be adjusted. So that would be a broader approach than what we're talking about today. Today is pretty narrow, but could have some benefit. So it's looking at reducing the transition area in potentially a wide range of zoning districts. So it could have certainly some effect. I don't want to downplay that as it's less broad than the study, but would have a significant effect. So just a quick recap of existing transition requirements, because that's mostly what we're about today. And just a way of thinking about it, where you have your detached house in the residential district, 3 basic types of transitions. And the first can be as little as 10 feet, a landscaped area. Then the next is what we've been calling and what I'll call the no-build area. So that's where there wouldn't be a primary building. Typically that's going to be parking or landscaping. That's 50 feet. So a lot of this is about whether that 50 feet needs to be 50 feet. And then there's a third zone that applies, and that's where, and it's better shown on this diagram to the left, starting in that third zone, height has to be 40 feet at the edge, and then it can scale up. So we're talking more really about that no-build zone and whether or not in the mixed-use district, so right now the building could be here, that's a little crude, but would it be reasonable if we're talking about certain uses in the detached frontage or residential use, reasonable for that to extend further into that district. And it's worth noting that we do in fact allow that to be the case already in the code in a couple different ways. One would be where we have RX3 zoning. So in RX3, that building, that mixed-use building can come within 10 feet because it recognizes that that is not, residential uses there are not a terrible, they're not inconsistent with residential uses in the residential zone. So there's no need to have such a large no-build transition. And then the historic alley transition, which was passed by council not that long ago, and that's what I'm going to use as a model for the proposal today. That looks at residential uses in other zoning districts. So it could be OX, NX, CX, a lot of the mixed-use districts in the city that allow residential uses. If there is, and I'll talk about the alley transition first, and then we'll talk about how that could be a model for a revised transition more broadly, regardless of whether there's an alley or not. But the alley transition says when there is an alley that separates, let's just say this is an alley, the residential district from the mixed-use district, then if there are a couple of conditions met, that transition can be reduced. So one would be that the height in that area not be taller than the height that's allowed in the residential district. So imagine just extending this plane out of 40 feet, and that would be the height limit. So an additional reduction on height. And then secondly, that they be residential uses. So even if the district is OX or NX, something that allows office or commercial, this only contemplates residential uses along the alley. And that's why it's a good complement or a good model for thinking about transitions more broadly. It does require the alley transition a couple other points that are less applicable here. So one would be if there's structured parking, must be screened, and that there be alley-facing entrances at least every 100 feet. So the question then is that 50-foot no-build transition, is it, well, it already recognizes, the code does, that it's not necessary in all situations. Then the question would be, are there some additional situations where it's also reasonable to reduce that no-build area? So boiling this down to two options, and one focuses just on the detached frontage, for which we have, and I'll show you a map that shows where existing properties are designated with that frontage. It's not a great deal. It's a couple hundred. So this would not apply very broadly unless in the future that detached frontage as a zoning classification is applied to more properties. So this would be a pretty narrow application, but the proposal would be to allow that transition to only be 10 feet in these detached frontage zone properties, because the intent is you have a detached form. It's already a more neighborhood scaled, more residential scaled form in these districts, and it would be reasonable to see less of a transition there. So it would facilitate, and I've broken this down into a couple of categories, would facilitate more housing and office space. This would apply to potentially both residential or office uses. Applicability, as I mentioned, fairly narrow. Only a few hundred parcels currently have that zoning. Could be applied more broadly. In the future, there is a constraint that ought to be noted. These are pretty small parcels. Again, they're residential houses for the most part. They now have some different uses. And so the parcels are, by definition, fairly small. There may not be, in many cases, a lot of room for them to include both parking in the transition area and some building. So that's just something to keep in mind, that as a practical matter, it may not facilitate that much of a difference. That may be good or bad depending on your perspective, but in either case, probably not a radically different proposal. The second one is fairly different. And so the intent of this is to apply that historic alley transition, the theory behind that, much more broadly, and say, well, if we have a residential use, so the theory of that is there's a residential use, it probably is not that much of a conflict in terms of use to the residential zoning adjacent to it. So why not allow less of a transition? So what could be done is in all these zoning categories that do allow residential uses, mixed use zoning categories, if they limit the use within that transition to residential only and limit the height to what would be allowed in the residential district. So say R6 would be 40 feet maximum. So they drop the height down, residential only, then in exchange would allow, instead of the 50-foot no-build area, say a 20-foot no-build transition zone. Could even be 10 feet, which would be the same as RX3. So the result there would be, obviously there's a lot of properties that are zoned OX or NX or CX across the city, many thousands. And so potentially a fairly broad benefit. Also, many of those properties are larger than the detached frontage properties, so probably less issues with taking advantage of that additional room in the transition area. So those are the two big options. One thing I did want to note that the committee has talked about is the issue of detached frontage and whether it truly achieves detachment. And that first option that's kind of predicated on the idea that we're going to do a little bit more to ensure that these detached buildings are actually detached. Because right now you could combine several properties and you could do a fairly large building. There's nothing that actually prevents that in that frontage. So one option would be to require some additional rules in detached that actually accomplish that. So a maximum building size, a side yard requirement, limitation on the number of townhouses that can be in one bank of townhouses, lower height limit, reduced signage area, and prohibiting retail. So again, aimed at making those uses a little bit more compatible with residential areas. So these are areas, so the narrower approach, just looking at it detached and where that is applied right now, this is showing, so the areas in color are where we have that frontage, and then if you can see, hopefully, I think you can see pretty well, the areas where there's a black boundary, that's where you have detached immediately adjacent to a residential zone. So that's where that transition really would be a question, and there's a couple dozen of those.
So is this existing detached? I mean, what about this whole conversation started with the older houses on Hillsborough Street?
Right.
There doesn't look like very many of them.
There's not. No, this has not been applied very widely. That's
Oh,
correct.
so this is just where it has been applied, is what you're
Correct.
saying? Okay, okay.
That's right.
Nothing that, the other,
So I guess my question is, we started a lot of this conversation with thinking about these older houses on Hillsborough Street and wanting to provide some sort of incentive, which you talked about at the beginning, to have them stay the way they are, blah, blah, blah. So how does allowing 5 townhouses how does that provide incentive for keeping that older house? And
That's less about that incentive and more just assuring that this frontage, it's really, think of it as a zoning district, that it is actually achieving what we hope that it does. So right now, for instance, in fact, what may help to talk about this, I have a couple examples really specific of where it's applied right now. So this is both the zoning map and it's the same area on the aerial. So here's Hillsborough and West Park and East Park. And so along Hillsborough, that's zoned OX3 detached, and you have R6 on the north side of it. So right now, there's really nothing that would prevent someone from combining all these properties and doing one large building, which is not the intent
Right.
of detached. So it would do two things to put those additional restrictions on detached. One, it would ensure that someone didn't combine a couple, if again, that's what we want along Hillsborough Street. Combine a couple and create a building that's out of scale with the other buildings. And two, it removes an incentive for doing that more broadly. If I all of a sudden don't have an incentive to combine all those lots, then that's another way of encouraging the existing lot pattern and buildings to remain. Again, our options really are somewhat limited. The market is driving a lot of that. The bigger tool would be probably a preservation designation But this is another way of getting to it.
I think we were kind of looking for both. I mean, the preservation still just means you file for your demo permit,
That's
you have to
right.
wait a year, so it's not,
That's right. That's not a final answer either. So I think it's looking at, on the margins, what can we do to incentivize or disincentivize what we want or don't want. And I have one more example of where it's applied right now, and this is, I think, helpful in thinking about the transitions. So this is 5 Points, this is Fairview Road, and we actually have a couple of these districts right next to each other. So we have some RX3 detached and some OX3 detached. So, and there's some recent development, so we're talking less about what might happen in any kind of near term. But in theory, so this RX3 can come to within 10 feet of the district boundary. The OX3, you could do the exact same type of building, a townhouse or apartment. But because it's OX instead of RX, it would have to have a 50-foot transition. So exact same building, exact same use, nothing at all being different except the zoning district. And in the OX, you would have a much larger transition and much less potentially utilization of the site. So the question is that the rational distinction that we would want? So, and I want to leave room for questions, but we had also talked a little bit about outreach. So one question would be if there's additional outreach that's desired. So we had put a little thought into that. And if so, then what we could do is take a look at those existing areas where you have on one hand detached zoning, on the other hand residential zoning. We could invite all those residents, property owners to drop in a really informal way, an office hours kind of approach here at the municipal building, and explain some options and get some feedback from them if that's desired. And really all I have is kind of summarizing these two different options. And I'll add a third option, which is no change, certainly another possibility coming out of this. So option one, reducing that transition for all residential uses based on the allied transition model. Number two, reducing the transition in the detached areas only, and then possibly also including those limitations that ensure detachment. Option three is no change. And potentially there's some other processes in the future that would take a look at missing middle housing in particular and might look at some of these same questions. So I don't think option three would mean no change ever, but it would be no change for the moment.
so
And then would there be a desire for some outreach?
number one, reduce transition for all residential uses.
Yes.
For detached frontage? What are we talking?
In any mixed-use district that allows residential. So that would be,
Oh, any mixed-use district that allows resident.
right, OX, NX, CX, just aligning that requirement with RX. So going back to that last example, if that was the option that was chosen, then in this, forget the detached frontage here for a moment. In OX3, if this person wanted to
Right.
develop some residential, it would only need to have a 10-foot transition.
So a lot of this is really about infill development, right? And
Yeah.
where you guys are doing or are still analyzing the results of the survey, but some of the top line headlines where, people are concerned about losing tree canopy, people are concerned about stormwater runoff. And so I'm wondering how these options might impact those two things.
Well, I think with respect to stormwater runoff, they would be required to meet that regardless, and might have to get creative in terms of how they plan
do
their
that.
site.
Mm-hmm.
And with tree conservation as well, if it's over a certain size, then there would be just an absolute requirement to
Right,
meet
but
the tree conservation standards.
But a lot of these would probably be so small that we wouldn't be able to.
That's correct, less than
require
2
that.
acres.
Yeah.
So that's right. So then the trade-off would be, if this does accommodate some additional housing units in this area at the expense of some trees in this area, is that the exchange is there's less development and I guess a less compact form somewhere else and more trees lost somewhere else.
So my initial comment is that there's sort of three topics that brought us to this point. The first one was that detached frontage doesn't accomplish the intended goal, because you can have unlimited size building with a detached frontage, as opposed to the intent would be to break it up into smaller chunks that are more compatible with surrounding, I guess, really residential neighborhoods. Second was, the mayor said, we've got these great old houses that we ought to be able to rehab them. What can we do to put them to constructive use and not just have them scraped off? And then third was, in that same area along Hillsborough Street, the Cameron Park neighborhood came in and said, hey, there's this interesting circumstance here with an alley that we just as soon have compatible development on the other side of that alley on the mixed-use side rather than just having parking lots and dumpsters. And so they brought forward their own idea of allowing compatible development in that what we'll call the 50-foot no build. To me, that was a very strong move that showed the cooperation between the commercial property owners and the residential property owners, saying there's something that's going to be better for all of us than 50 feet of no build, typically parking lots and utility activities. We haven't seen much action on that yet. Likewise, we don't really have any tools at our disposal, very strong ones, to promote adaptive reuse of some of these older homes. So we really don't have a good way to get at that. And I'm not sure anything we've talked about today touches on that concern. Doesn't mean we couldn't get there. And then finally, the idea that we could just, if you go back to the Cameron Park site plan or zoning map again, yeah, obviously we could just come in and put a new DE frontage. We could just rewrite DE to mandate maximum 8,000 square feet, and that would, obviously that would be contested likely by the property owners. So we've been trying to figure out a way to thread the needle here to do something other than 50 feet of no build. Again, I don't see anything that we've talked about that really enhances the chance for adaptive reuse of older homes. I really do like the historic alley transition, which of course it shows up right off the edge of, yeah, right there it is, right there. That, you know, if those properties redeveloped, they actually could take advantage of that compatible development and what would other be the 50-foot no build on the Hillsborough Street side of the alley.
So can I ask a question real quick? Would it be possible for us to somehow tie the detached frontage zoning to the historic designation? So if they either have or receive a historic designation and they want to, quote, rezone it for commercial whatever use, that fine, but you have to operate that, you have to have this zoning to do it. So if I buy a 150-year-old house on whatever, and I want to rehab it and turn it into a dentist's office or a law office, and so I would assume I'd have to get a rezoning because it's residential, I'm going to use it for business. But if I want to do that, and the house has a, you know, I'm applying for the tax credits because it's historic, it has to have a detached frontage zoning, which means I'm not going to get all those permits and then change my mind and tear it down and build 3 stories of whatever.
Well, I mean, you can answer, I can answer. I can say with the, are you talking about an overlay? Like an
No.
Oakwood Mordecai historic designation?
No, I'm just talking about, there's different properties around that have that historic designation.
Or are you talking about a landmark kind of thing?
We're just trying to figure out how to save
Right.
these old
Well, what I was
houses.
going to
That's
say
all we're doing.
is if you get the overlay, then, you know, you have to have the state come in and you have certain things and you have to get this certificate of appropriateness, but the underlying zoning is still going to apply. but then you got to make sure those match up enough to get you approved to do something. So, maybe not, would be my,
And I think that's something the council has the power to do. If someone has, and we're talking about a rezoning, if they're coming in with a property that is along the lines of what we're talking about, then council would have the right to say what zoning district is most appropriate, and can reject one that doesn't feel like it's going to meet the goals that we're talking about. Now, that doesn't mean that applying and approving a rezoning that includes the detached frontage would necessarily prevent tearing it down, but because detached does include some of these limitations and potentially adding more, that could make it more likely that structure is retained in the future.
Okay, I got another way to get at what you're talking about.
Okay.
So these three houses, just, can you highlight them again? They're already not residentially zoned. Can you highlight them? There they are, all three of those. Okay, so they don't need to rezone to do it. But if we said, we'll give you the development option in the 50-foot no-build if you substantially retain the
But I don't think
historic.
they have, do they have 50 feet? One of them.
I'm just saying, they could do a big addition off the back.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to get them to do.
So I'm saying, rather
Oh.
than saying you got to get a rezoning from residential, which they don't have to do,
Right.
we would say, we're going to allow you to add construction into the 50-foot
Right.
no-build if you protect the older building in the front.
And how would we do that other than on a,
We just make the rule. If you want to build in the 50-foot no-build, you've got to comply with retaining the historic building.
but on what? On buildings that have a historic designation?
Or, well, we could decide whether it was any building over 50 years old.
Can we
I mean-
change the map?
No, well, no, look, I mean, anything over 50 years old can be generally eligible for historic designation. So you can just say, if it's a building older than 50 years, I mean, that's very crude, but, because it could be something not worth saving. But it wouldn't have to have a historic designation to say, this is a building that, you know, is consistent with historic streetscape, and we'd like to retain that streetscape, so help us do that, and we'll give you some development potential in the back. So now,
I'm just trying to figure out, how do we apply, I mean, if we'd like to apply that to all these properties that are important to us, can we do that?
I think you could, but there would be a lot of different ways you could sort of go at it.
That's what I'm trying to.
And there are certain statutes that allow you to have historic overlays and designations, and those have certain rules. But again, if you wanted to have some different scheme where you would have certain, I think,
pass that one down to Marshall.
well, it's got to be in a historic overlay to be able to do aesthetics, right? So,
But we're not talking, well, we're talking about just retaining an existing building, we're not,
well, I'm
Trying
talking
to say-
about the historic character.
All right.
You've got to get under certain regulations to be able to do that, because, you know, single family, you can't, or two or three, you can't do aesthetics, and so, but you have an exception for that if it's in a historic overlay or has historic things going on. So that's what, it would take some studying, but I think that you could get there.
all right. So this, enough there. Jason, can you hand you one of these two? This is standing on the far side of West Park Drive, which is right there on the picture. So can you generally make a mark? I mean, I was standing right next to the Christian Science Church shooting this way. So basically got a beautiful, a perfect site section through the residential and the non-residential parcel there. And so what I've done in this sketch is I've said, okay, generally you'll start, zero grade will be at street level. So in this case, since it's downhill, you'll grade out level to the back of the parcel. In this case, I just picked the 10-foot number. And then you could go up 3 stories, which is, maybe it couldn't be this tall in Cameron Park where it's 38 feet to the peak via the NCOD. But in areas where it was just standard residential zoning or OX3, you could go up 3 stories. And then, so my sense is we need to be careful that we,
That's what we have now. That's the problem.
no, we got 50 feet no build now.
No,
So
but
that,
I mean, but we have this 3-story block all along Hillsborough Street.
but we have the 50-foot no build.
Right, well, I'm not as worried about that as I am I'm trying to figure out how do we keep that nice white house there?
Okay. Well,
I mean,
so I'm not, this entire discussion is a completely different discussion than that one.
so what is your point with this picture?
The point is to say is if we allow development in the 50-foot no build up to 10 feet off the property line, which is where that power pole is, you're going to get some pretty tall buildings right
Yeah.
next to residences. That's the point of that.
Oh, okay.
And it's compounded by the discussion item that's in the residential infill study, which is how do you start measuring ground floor level when you're filling on a site? Because here you're going to be filling on that site to get
So
floor level up.
right now, all on Hillsborough Street, I think was remapped to 3 stories.
It's OX3.
OX3.
Yep.
So my question for the last year and a half has been, what can we do to help save those houses so that the owners are more financially incentivized to retain them than tear them down and build a 3-story block like Russ has pictured here, whether it's a 10-foot or 50-foot buffer in the back? And you're saying that this detached frontage would allow them to expand, add on to the structure, they could keep the structure the way it is,
And it would disincentivize combining of lots.
and it would disincentivize combining.
But the carrot, I mean, the stick was you can't build over 8K bulk. But the carrot would be, we're going to allow you to do something compatible in what was before the 50-foot no build. Is that?
Right.
So you can only go into the 50-foot, to me, you can only go into the 50-foot no build if you're keeping that house there and you may be doing an addition on the back or something.
So unfortunately, I mean, I'm with you. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the thrust of studying how to incentivize the detached frontage as a citywide. The thrust of this thing has been, we've got this giant 50-foot no build all over the city. And how can we find a way to make more compatible use of it than just as a parking lot and dumpsters? I'm all about both of these conversations, so.
I think part of it is what, we did do the alleyway transition, and part of it is what Steph said, which is that's what the infill study's
Right.
looking at. But I'm just trying to figure out how to save some of what we got. And
it is a
detached frontage would help, but you're saying to apply it to any of those specific. My question was, can we add this to, if you have a historic designation and you want to build on it, you have to, if you want to expand on that lot, you have to use detached frontage to do it.
Maybe. I think we need some more time to study exactly how to make that happen. I mean, you can zone it however you want to zone it, but my concern is you wouldn't want to put a historic overlay on something and zone it some way, and then they go to the Historic Commission and they say, well, it's not going to be, because how you get your historic designation is going to be determined whether you're consistent or congruous with the area. So if the zoning you put on it is going to bump you out of that approval, then that's the thing you'd have to think about, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So not to say you can't do it, but I think it would take a little more studying to come up with ways that you might marry those two together. Or that's just my thought, and you planners can jump in.
So, in your mind, do you think just having the detached frontage as an option for some of these houses is helpful until we could figure out?
So I'll answer that.
Okay.
And it will depend on the individual. If they think they can accommodate their use in an existing older home and it'll save them money, they will. If they think that there's a market to take the building out and build the kind of stuff that's getting built on the other side of the street, which is not far away, they'll say, you know, hell no, I'm gonna build some of these box apartments that are getting built up and down Hillsborough Street.
I think if the detached frontage limits what you can do on that site with the cap on overall square footage and the setbacks and so on, in ways that it doesn't do right now, because it really just envisions existing houses, and that there's a desire to continue those uses in that existing structure. But it doesn't prohibit demolition, and it doesn't do much to limit what you could do if, you know, for instance, on these houses, someone could remove those houses and build a much larger structure right now. So if the detached frontage basically limits down the building envelope well below what you could do otherwise in, say, OX3, then yeah, I do think it has a pretty strong incentive for keeping what's there. And if someone is looking to rezone, then, and it's that similar kind of context, then the choice for council would be, well, would just OX3 be appropriate? And that basically says green light to do whatever you want, or OX with the detached frontage, which has these potentially limitations on building envelope and would be more likely, it doesn't guarantee, I don't think there's any way to guarantee that the structure remains, but it makes it that much more likely that it would remain because there's much less room, no reason to tear it down if you can't build something larger.
Okay.
But I'm thinking of right across the street, not exactly where the Waffle House was, but very close to where the Waffle House is. I mean, there's just a 3-story box apartment, and it may be deeper than you could achieve here, but I mean, the market has already proved that it's ready and willing to build that kind of unit, and we'll take out an old house to get it done if the conditions are right.
So can we put a historic overlay, or like, we decided we wanted to go down Hillsborough Street and put a historic overlay over all those?
There's a process to do it. You would have to go through a historic study, talk to SHPO, all of that, and if they find that there's a period of time and it has that, yes, you would go through a process, but that is something you could potentially do. If you'd have to find that that area has a time of historic significance and a type of architecture and all of those things and check some boxes, but if you get through all of that, the answer is yes.
So
We don't get just say, this is going to be a historic overlay. There has to be some background and study done.
So that's actually 4 stories. So that's a little bit bigger than I was remembering it, but I mean, that's what the market wants to do there.
Right, and that's a lot larger than potentially a revised version of detached would accommodate.
Yeah,
And that's a larger lot.
So
And you know, I'm looking at it, and yeah, but it is. It might be 3 of the other lots.
So we have detached frontage now, right? We have the zoning for detached frontage. So
Yeah,
your
yes.
comment is if we change the detached frontage to be 10 feet in the back as opposed to 50 feet, it would allow these older houses they wanted to add on to accommodate business.
And with some additional restrictions that basically guarantee house size structures on detached that don't exist right now.
Okay.
All right, well.
So they can't build this with the detached frontage.
Yeah,
They can't build this.
Yeah, they can.
3-story.
They could. If you don't say you've got to retain the existing building, there's nothing that will keep them from saying, you know, the economics going to be better if we just take that thing out and build the other thing I just showed
I'm
you.
just talking about the detached frontage.
Right.
Sorry.
So these are some, what you see in front of you right now, some potential additions. None of these requirements exist. So there is no limitation on building size. There's not even a side yard requirement. So again, I could take 3 parcels, I could combine them, and I could put one, say, apartment building on that, which may serve some other goals, but doesn't necessarily serve the goals that the detached frontage is looking to achieve, that detachment. Lower height limit, that's another one. So a couple different ways of reducing the building envelope that could be accomplished through some refinements to the detached frontage. And if the desire is to authorize a text change process, then there would be additional public review, obviously, in planning commission, city council, and more time also for conversations with property owners and for staff to think about really what is the right limit that would allow some reasonable level of use of these properties, but also not necessarily encourage removing the existing structures the way there might be an encouragement to do that now.
Okay.
Well, again, so, I mean, this house is this house right here. And it's 2 stories.
Right.
And if someone says, if I can get a little more development potential on the back and go up to 3 stories as opposed to 4, unless you have something that says that physical structure has to be retained, there's
Then
no
how do we say
reason
that?
someone's gonna give that.
But right now, on Hillsborough Street,
Yep.
it's allowed to be it's allowed to tear down and do that. That's what I'm trying to prevent.
And I'm saying if you don't do something that says we're gonna give you some additional, the incentive is the additional entitlement, but the incentive is in return for
Taking
retaining.
the original structure.
If you don't make that the deal, you're not gonna get anything other than someone going, wow, that looks pretty good across the street.
I guess the question would be, how could we require retention of the original structure in the absence of a historic designation, and even potentially with a historic designation?
I don't think you could require it. I think that you could potentially, which I can't do off the top of my head, have regulations, like you said, that would encourage people to do that. It would be economically better for them to keep it than not keep it, but you can't, or you can, zone heights and building envelopes and that kind of thing, but as far as saying you got to keep that structure, you can't even do that in a historic district, because you have the 365, and then, but you have to build it back with the historic character and the elements and that kind of thing, but not letting someone take it down is more probably problematic.
So actually, if we remapped Hillsborough Street to 1 story, then.
There you go. There you go.
Okay,
There you
whatever you got, I want some of that.
Then it's not
Remap it
conform.
to
Yeah,
1
yeah,
story,
yeah, yeah.
and then if they want to add on, they'd come to us and we'd say, we have this wonderful option where you can add on, but,
Well,
for
at that
detached
point-
frontage, and there's your parameters, but that's as much as you can do.
I'm with you. Just need 3 more votes.
Well, I think if you say it's 1 story, nobody would ever tear anything down, because
Okay.
then they would be
Ta-da!
non-conforming, and they couldn't rebuild except back to 1 story.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's certainly a legal possibility now.
We're not really having this conversation, are we?
But,
2 stories.
that's
I've been trying for
That's-
6 years to figure out how to save these old
I know you have.
structures.
Yeah.
And when they're gone, they're gone.
Right,
So if we don't figure it out, they're gonna be gone.
right, right. And so I think I've been quiet. I appreciate y'all's priorities in this conversation, right? Like I hear your priorities and your values and where you're at in wanting to preserve these older homes, especially on Hillsborough Street, but in other areas in the city that we saw on the map. My priority is a little different in wanting to make sure that we can get the best and most productive use out of that existing land so that we can house all the people who are here and who are coming here. I respect where you're at, though, and I mean, I feel like we have some options for how to do what y'all want to do, but it sounds like y'all are agreeing while disagreeing, and I'm very confused where you want to go today.
I think we're all agreeing that we would like to figure out how to save these. We're just not unsure of what the best path forward for it is.
And we've been having this conversation for like a year and a
We've
half.
had it for 6 years, actually.
So,
Yeah, so,
okay, well,
Because there is no way to solve it. That's
right.
for me, the basic conversation is about how can we get better use of the land that is now in a 50-foot no-build that is compatible with adjacent neighborhood. That's been my conversation.
Right.
Okay? And, there's some opportunities to mesh something with detached frontage and what the historic alley transition that people worked out. Those, to me, are ways to move this forward so we don't just end up having a 50-foot no-build, but something that is compatible, that everybody agrees is better than a 50-foot no-build. The issue of protecting historic structures, it's a more difficult nut to crack. It hasn't been one that I've been focused on because I didn't see any way to do it. So I'm sorry if this conversation has been confusing. I don't think the historic aspect has been front of my mind, and I don't think it's been in front of staff's mind in this discussion. Obviously, it's been in front of yours for a long time, and I do love the idea of being able to adaptively reuse these buildings instead of tearing them down. But you know, and if we can provide some kind of development potential here that is the quid pro quo, for maintaining the existing building in the front and adaptively reusing it, that would be great.
I mean, I think what he has presented is probably the best tool we have under the umbrella of what we're allowed to do. I'm looking at Robin.
Well, yeah, right now, again, historic overlays is a different
Yeah.
ball of wax. I mean, if you wanted to do that, you would send it to the Historic Preservation Commission and tell them to look at it and study it, and it's sort of a process. With what we got now, yeah, I think that's the best, unless you do something like, you know, rezone them all to one story, and then nobody's going to tear them down, which of course that's sort of not really probably how you want to deal with it. I mean, you could, but again, I mean, we could go back and work with the planners and try to come up with some more options.
Well, is it looking at doing this detached frontage and then following up with looking at the possibility of a historic overlay for if
Sure.
we just
Sure.
did those
Sure.
houses on
If that's,
Hillsborough
if that's
Street.
the desire, then absolutely that could be
Okay, say that
explored, and we
again.
could
Yeah,
engage the
yeah.
Historic Preservation Commission to,
Yeah.
they would probably want some degree of scope on that, what to look at specifically.
Or geographic scope too, probably.
yeah,
Are you
that's what
talking
I'm
about Hillsborough
thinking
Street or
about.
pulling in part of Cameron Park or whatever? I mean, I think or that one line of sort of larger old houses.
So, you might be-
Now would make probably, there's probably more about, might make it easy to say Hillsborough Street from the PR to the Capitol. I mean, I know not everything in there is historic, but
But there are.
there are a lot. So that would be the Historic Districts Commission to figure out what worked and what didn't work.
Well, that's one of their charges,
Okay.
is to investigate potential new historic overlay districts. So that's certainly within their powers and authority to go down that road at your direction.
What do you think of that?
So you'd be asking to create a historic overlay zoning district that just, I know that they demand contiguity, and I'm thinking, boy, that's gonna be tricky.
Well, I mean, I don't know, that's their job. You know, I mean, you think about sometimes there's rows of houses and sometimes there's a few and then a chunk of not worth and, you know, already redone, and then there's,
Well, congruity is based on, you know, what historic is there and is there enough to have a district in that, so they wouldn't make the rules according
No.
to the new stuff. It would only be according to the older buildings would be
No,
the things that,
I'm talking about contiguity.
oh,
They won't let you do a historic, at least the National Register. You cannot do a historic district that the properties are not contiguous. So you can't have a section here and a section there and a section there that are not connected somehow.
well, if you look at Oakwood back in the old days, every house in there was not one that was, you know, historic district. As a matter of fact, that there
No,
was,
there can be non-contributing structures, but
Right.
I'm just saying, you'd have to figure out a logical way to
Right, and I
connect it
don't
all
know that.
together into one geographic.
that's why we let the Historic District.
yeah, I mean, they may say no way
They may
at
say
all.
you can't do it. I'm just
Yeah, but they would be the
asking if
people
we
who looked at it and made
send
that
it to
call.
them and ask them to look at it.
But again, so it would just be a one-year demolition delay is all we'd get out of that?
Yes,
Well-
but when they rebuild, they've got to rebuild
In the-
in a congruous manner to the district as a whole. So if you rip down a newer building, you would have to put back a building that fit in the district. So that delay is to try to not get you to tear it down, but when you tear it down, you have to put back something that fits.
And
So,
then that
and that could be height and all kinds of
combination
things.
with this would maybe help
Okay.
facilitate people adding onto the back or whatever if they have more of an ability to.
Okay.
And I don't know one way or the other. I said, that's the process that you would go through to look at it, and you could get them to look at it and see what they say back, which
Okay.
could be, no way, or it could be, oh, yeah, maybe. I don't know, because
Can you flip back to the slide before this? It talked about oh, no. It was the one that had the list of like the 8,000 square feet and what the,
Proposed.
That's it,
D-
yeah.
Yep.
I mean, I guess I feel like this is at least a starting and would be an option for people if they have one of those houses or they want to expand. It would be a zoning that would allow them to expand and use more of the lot while keeping the original character of the house, while the Historic Districts Commission looks at the viability of, and then we'd still have that tool.
Tell me what the 45 under lower height limit, 45 feet THAPT?
That's really similar to the thought process behind the alley transition, that the height would be aligned not with what would typically be allowed in the mixed-use district, but instead with what would be allowed if it were a residential
Okay,
property.
so under these rules, we could have something that looks like this? Depending on where you measure, if you measure ground floor from up on Hillsborough Street and that's your 40-foot number?
I think the bulk of that is larger than what would be allowed with these. So looking at 8,000 square feet total,
Well, this
I
could
think
be,
that's a
this
larger
isn't a
bulk.
wide building, this is a one-lot building. This is like a hexaplex, you know? Two on each level, going 3 levels.
So
This
that
could be done
would-
on one parcel.
That would be one of the variables that
And
could be
again,
addressed.
and if it was 1,200 square units and you had 6 of them,
Right.
you
So-
could do it.
So the question really would be,
You might not
and
be able to
especially
park
for
it.
building size, what would be the maximum that would be reasonable for properties along streets like Hillsborough, but also essentially is aligned with a large detached, but a detached house size.
And I've forgotten, what is the rule that exempts parking for what, isn't it 6 units? Your parking exempt?
For,
Travis remembers. What's the parking exemption?
16 units.
16 units, okay. So this thing could get built on one parcel for 6, or maybe they could squeeze in 9 units with no parking. And, my question is that the relationship to the neighborhood we are looking for?
I think that's a good question.
So in that regard,
So you're saying that these refinements produce this?
if this was narrow enough to fit on one lot and this was less than, a grand total of 8,000 square feet of building, yeah, you could build that. You could build 3 of them in a row, one on each of the residential lots. You could build 4 of them in a row. They'd all be, the little 6-foot setbacks.
So what do they have now? OX3?
Yep. So they could
And the
build
difference is
this.
they have to have 50 foot.
They have to have 50 feet instead of 10 feet.
Okay. But there's
Well-
no way, you're saying there's no way to say you can go to the 10 feet if you retain the original structure? We can't say that, right?
not without,
Okay.
not without some other things happening.
So I heard a comment about, of course, at the work session, we heard might be good to bring in the finished product for policies around residential infill as it relates to these kinds of physical adjacency impacts. I've heard a discussion about looking at historic district, looking at overlay along Hillsborough Street. And I've also heard staff say there might be an opportunity or reason for some outreach. And you said informal. I'm thinking to get some feedback on these options. I think those are all good ideas.
How do we get outreach if we don't make the decision about what we're gonna do with the
Well,
detached
ask-
frontage?
Well, I mean, you just,
It would be outreach about the kinds of questions and proposals that we've discussed today.
Okay.
And that would be, so that's one option. The other option, again, would be, because there would certainly be some public engagement if a text change is authorized, to just allow that process to handle that engagement.
yeah,
Two options there.
except I don't think we're close to picking the right one quite yet.
Okay. Can we move forward with asking the Historic Districts
No,
Commission?
I'd say go forward with all three. I'm saying,
What were the other two?
well, one was get the feedback from the infill study
Yeah.
to see what kind of mitigations they come up with
Okay.
for these kinds of impacts when you're getting that close adjacency, you know. That's one. Second would be ask RHDC about an overlay along Hillsborough Street. And the third one is do some outreach to people who would be most affected by this. I went over to Fairview and looked at the parcels over there that could have the same kind of development. They slope down too, so they'd have some fill in the back. And there are two-story houses right behind them. And I imagine the folks, if you suggest this kind of thing could be 10 feet off the back line, you'd get some interesting comments.
Right. Okay. Is that a motion?
Well, I guess the question is I mean, the first two seem straightforward. We wait for the infill study. Second one is we ask RHDC. The third one is how do we do an effective outreach on all these options? It seems like it's a lot for anyone to try to,
Seems to me if we're going to get the infill study results, maybe we do that and then conduct the outreach based on some of that.
Okay.
I don't know.
so don't do any outreach until we're a little further along deciding which is the right option. Does that make sense? Okay, all right. Well, then the motion is to hold this in committee, ask RHDC to work on a historic overlay along Hillsborough Street from PR to Capitol, and to get the results of the infill study.
And then future outreach after the infill study.
After we narrow the scope a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And so still considering, so both of these, option one and option two, really a little bit different, both about transitions, but almost could have separated that conversation. But considering both of those options, so reducing it really across the board under the alley transition model, that's more the housing side. And then option two is the narrower one that we've spent a little bit more time discussing, but considering both of those options.
Well,
Well,
tell me
do
exactly.
you want to focus it more on just the reduced transition and detached frontage? Stop laughing.
See, so are the
How many
options,
racers you been through today?
as I look at the memo, option two is the one that says use historic alley transition as the model. And now here on this one, it's option one,
Okay,
so now
yeah,
I'm confused.
it may be flipped, but those are the two basic options.
Okay, well, so I'd go for, I mean, as I read through the memo, it was the option based on the historic alley transition. Text change was the one that I think is going to be the one that will get us to a place where, the same way that the Cameron Park neighborhood got to a compromise that worked for everybody, as opposed to something that's going to create an uproar, like this would.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I apologize for flipping these, but so the historic alley transition is the one where we've talked about applying that more broadly. across all the, so continuing to look at that?
Yes.
Okay,
No,
and
that's-
also
I mean,
continue,
that, to me, that is the gold standard. We don't have many, but it's the gold standard that the compromise has been made and everybody has agreed to. And if that's the model that we should pattern these other citywide attempts at getting compatible use of that 50-foot no build, then let's, I would say, stay focused right there.
Okay.
All right, any more questions, comments?
We're,
We're gonna hold this until the infill study results come back, and we're gonna look at the ones that apply to this kind of transition zone we're talking about. We're going to ask RHDC to give council a report on the idea of a historic district running along Hillsborough Street from, I'll say, the bell tower to the Capitol. Is that,
sure.
PR is a little bit, it's a great landmark, but. And then the third one is
Knows
that
what
we
I
are
know.
going to continue the conversation of looking at these options when the infill study comes back, with the idea that we will then, once we have a little bit more carefully crafted scope, then look to do some stakeholder outreach. Is that? I don't know.
That's a motion.
Okay, that's a motion.
Oh,
All in favor?
sorry, old habit, sorry.
All right, is everybody, Gail,
Yep.
you straight now? Oh, yes. Okay, all right. All right, thanks so much. We're stand adjourned.